My name's Gideon. I represent Cleopatra Enterprise, and I'm from the Netherlands. Flew in all the way to tell you a little bit about what we do with our tool and how we can apply it in the project cost management processes, and in order to work with metrics and KPIs, how you can apply that. So what I'm going to tell you is a little bit of an introduction, obviously, of who I am and who we are as a company, and then telling you about what metrics actually are, how you can use them, why we think that they are important, and also some examples of different types of metrics that we typically encounter in the different phases of managing the projects. Then going more into the methodology in the second part of how to find them and how to use them with benchmarking intelligence. And then eventually, how you can apply them in your business objectives or project objectives, obviously, and some conclusions after this. After that, we'll have some time for questions and answers. So please, feel free to add to that in the end. So, brief introduction about myself. I'm a Vice President of Business for Europe, Middle East, and Australia, so I tend to get some air miles in. Got some degrees, mostly commercial, but obviously I've also been schooled in cost estimating and cost control, mostly through our own cost engineering academy that we have within our company. And I've been consulting companies in different areas of, let's say, different areas of expertise, but mostly in technical industries over the last 9 years. So introducing the company that I work for, the company is called Cost Engineering Consultancy, and Cleopatra Enterprise is the software that we develop in-house and implement worldwide. We've got some almost 25 years experience as a company, basically being founded by two people that used to work for Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, so that's the Dutch legacy again. And we've been working as a consultancy and software company ever since. So we've got, indeed, a software solution called Cleopatra, which we develop in-house, and we do that both for the estimating, or basically Lexi came from the estimating side and developed it to a full project cost management platform. We're operating worldwide, so we've got clients on all 6 continents of the world, mostly serving them from our main office in Holland, and obviously doing quite a bit of flying around. Now, very important to stress that we're not just a software company, we're also a knowledge provider, so we also advise companies on how to approach their project cost management processes, and we typically help that with and serve that with an implementation of Cleopatra. And we also have our academy where we teach people about the practices of the cost engineering profession. So the vision of our company is basically a simplified version of the total cost management framework of the ACEI. Basically, we start a project with estimating, initially from a high-level conceptual perspective, and then working our way down to a more detailed cost estimate, also using a schedule, interfacing that in a parallel approach. And once we have that set up in a detailed way, we're able to use that information to create a budget and create a baseline to which we control the project. So within Cleopatra, you actually have the possibility to recast an estimate towards a budget in one of the different structures, the reporting structures that you'd have in there, such as a WBS, for instance, and then work our way into the execution to manage the project on, obviously, your costs, so commitments, actuals, as well as your progress, as well as your variations of changes, and use that information to report, forecast, and eventually use that information to steer the project into the right direction. Now, if the project has been executed, we're able to benchmark these results, create your own project archive, in order to do analysis on that, draw intelligence from that by finding metrics, for instance, but also trends, and applying that again in your new projects. And thereby, we continuously improve the way that we do projects. So with doing that, we try to basically be a part and help companies strengthen their knowledge and being able to bring in projects more efficiently. So here you can see some of the companies that we work for. So for instance, we're doing a global implementation of our estimating tool for Fluor. I also did a first implementation of that for BHP. And other than that, you can see a lot of other companies, both with a global as well as European footprint. So enough about, let's say, the basics of our company. Let's focus on metrics and KPIs. So what are metrics and what are KPIs? So metrics are values derived from the relation between two or more units of measurement. So basically, it's finding different units that you can compare to each other, and which makes sense if you draw a larger line on that. Key performance indicators, or KPIs, are metrics that demonstrate the performance of a project, a portfolio, of a company. So that means that actually all metrics can be used in different ways, but are not necessarily always KPIs. KPI is really when you add a certain goal to it, such as, for instance, what we call a CPI, Cost Performance Index, but we'll get to that later. So obviously you can use this information in different phases of your project during, for instance, estimating, cost control, and so on. And I'll be explaining a little bit more about how that works. So when I was starting to create this presentation, I was wondering a little bit myself, so where to start? Because there's so many things that are related to metrics and KPIs throughout the project lifecycle. I was wondering if anybody is using a certain metric or using a certain KPI in his or her work, which is worth mentioning. Anybody? Is nobody using any type of metric? Yes, sir, please. Cost Performance Index, definitely. So you are a project controller, I suppose. Any other types of metrics that you use in your work? Yeah, definitely. So yeah, that's the way we use it as well. So I see that's we're in a good way there. So actually, metrics are everywhere throughout the project lifecycle. So we can, for instance, apply them when we create an estimate in terms of factors. But we'll get to that as well in a little bit more detail. We also use it to measure the project performance. So indeed, using a cost performance index or a schedule performance index, productivity, any other way of applying that during your cost management phase. Additionally, we are able to derive types of metrics and types of KPIs during the benchmarking phase. So after projects have been executed, looking at, okay, what can we learn from this? How can we derive more information from this? Looking at a larger set of projects over a portfolio, maybe a larger set of assets. Cleopatra obviously offers the functionality in order to analyze that and draw that intelligence from your projects. So why do we think that these are important? Well, obviously, you can use them in so many different ways, and it's really essential of using that effectively, for instance, in creating early phase cost estimates. So definitely coming from the estimating background that we have as a company, we would say that having proper metrics and knowing the, let's say, relations between different parts of your project, how they typically end up, is essential in order to create those early phase estimates, because you're filling in a lot of blanks of things that you do not know yet. So if we look at, for instance, the estimates that we make in the process industry, you always see that there are certain cost drivers, such as your process equipment, or you have to look at your direct costs versus your indirect costs. And these are typical things that you can take into consideration when you do not know a lot of things about your definite scope yet. So same goes for KPIs, right? They can present a summarized overview of the project performance. So there's a whole lot of data that you're developing or generating during execution of your project. But how to make sense of all that data, it only becomes sensible if you summarize it and are able to benchmark it. So it's a good way of creating that full-on summary into a certain, number, which could be your KPI, obviously. So they also provide your early warnings, such as if you are in a certain phase of your project execution and you see indeed that your schedule is running behind or your progress is running behind on your scheduled progress, then yeah, your SPR would be somewhere below 1. It can help you to provide your early warnings. Same goes for your faulty investment decisions, which would be in your estimating phase. So if you see from a certain estimate that your piping cost would be just 20% of your mechanical cost, that may be an early warning that there's something wrong there, and you may want to have another look at your estimate and the assumptions made. So finally, obviously, KPIs and metrics are unbiased. Yeah, it's really looking at the hard facts of your project versus, let's say, the softer part of looking at, okay, where are we and what is installed at this moment. So some examples of metrics that we're using. Let's first go to how we use or how we break that down. So what we think is essential in finding KPIs is using breakdown structures. So familiar breakdown structures that we see typically being used in projects are obviously a work breakdown structure or a cost breakdown structure, but there's so many other ones that we can apply to the projects in order to break it down to standard chunks to allow for analysis. So for instance, a phased breakdown structure, an area breakdown structure, a material breakdown structure, and any type of other structures that you can think of, basically. So we've got clients using as many as 40 different breakdown structures in one document, and Cleopatra is very strong in that sense, being able to use and dissect all these use the structures to dissect all these projects. So for instance, in terms of disciplines, project phases, materials whatsoever. So let's see how we apply them in the different phases. Firstly, starting with estimating. So for instance, we would look at the metrics of the project capacity versus the total costs. Now, if we look at that for a number of different projects, there's things that we may derive from that. And if we know that we are looking for a new project that has a certain capacity, we may be able to, let's say, trend that capacity to a certain level to see what the assumed cost of the project would be. Same goes for your equipment costs versus the other discipline costs. Looking at, okay, if we typically have so much concrete, how much steel would we have opposed to that? Same goes for your direct costs versus your indirects. So obviously specific to scope versus your project management, supervision, facilities, and so on. If you only know something about the direct scope of your project, there's additional costs that you really need to take into account there as well. Material cost versus your labor cost, classic example as well. And any type of quantities that you want to compare to each other. So indeed, steel versus concrete, mechanical versus piping, electrical versus instrumentation, and so on. So one of the things that we derive from that as being we, not so much Cleopatra, but we being the industry, is a total installed cost methodology based on equipment. So it's one of the typical approaches in the process industry. For instance, the hand method or the Lang method. And these are typical factors that are being applied based on equipment, and using that as a basis, and then adding different, let's say, factor-based costs, factor-based labor hours for all the associated disciplines. So in order to get let's say, kind of a rough understanding of the amount of piping, electrical works, instrumentation, civil works, etc., in order to construct that project accordingly. So it's numerous and numerous years of doing project and analyzing that have gone into it, and what we've created within the tool is actually an automated version of that. So we can simply import your equipment into the tool, and then it automatically adds these costs for these different disciplines to it. So what we can do during creating that project or developing that project, we can do some express validation. So what you see here is we've put the material in the top example, put the material to 100%, and then you can see that how the costs of, for instance, your subcontracting or your installing, how that relates to the material costs. And if you know from different projects that you've executed in the past that your installing should be anywhere between 30 and 40% of your material, you know that you're in the green zone. So this is how you can do some quick benchmarking. Same goes for your direct costs versus your indirects. So if you put your directs at 100%, and you can see here that your indirects are, let's see, some 55, and I know that it should be somewhere between 50 and 60, whatever, you know you're in the green zone. And that's how you apply them in that estimating phase. So looking at cost management then. For instance, a cost performance index is a well-known KPI that's typically being used in earned value management. Same goes for your schedule performance index. Now, I wouldn't say that I'm a huge fan of schedule performance index, because definitely if you look at the later stages of your project, it always tends to get towards 1. And that's because of these different formulas that we've got here. So you've got your budgeted cost of work performed versus the budgeted cost of work scheduled, and eventually it always ends up at 1. So the cost performance index is different from that, and I think it gives you a bit of a better look at where you actually are of bringing your project in budget. Now what we can do inside Cleopatra is we can visualize these KPIs to make sure that they become easier to analyze and easier to adapt for people from a management level as well. So these kind of gauges, for instance, are definitely helping with that. And same goes for these other types of KPIs and that we can apply here. So for instance, the amount of meters of pipe per type of equipment, or the productivity changes. Now these are all things that you know that there's a certain standard that you're aiming for, and this is what you can apply during your cost management phase. Same goes for your engineering hours per equipment. If they're extremely low, you may want to have a look at the quality of your engineering works. Another thing is being able to track that through time, so seeing how that actually develops your project over the end. So eventually what you see in this graph, you see indeed your SPI tending towards the 1 eventually. But you can see that, yeah, quite some fluctuations, and that may tell you something about what has happened in your project at a certain period of time. Was that due to changes and variations, maybe due to bad weather? Definitely things that you can draw from that. So how can you find these different metrics and KPIs during your benchmarking phase? And the benchmarking phase being the phase where you've got the data from your projects, from different phases, bring it all together and draw intelligence from it. So that's how we use our benchmarking module as well in Cleopatra, collecting all these historical projects, either from an estimating perspective as well as from the cost management perspective, looking at the trends of how that has developed over time, but also various assets that are somewhat comparable, being able to draw lessons from that. So what we do is we normalize that information and we index it using indexation tables, for instance, between, let's say, getting it from 2014 standards up to 2019, but also to get it from maybe a different region standards up to Australian region standards. And after you do that normalization and indexation, being able to do some big data analysis on that, really to draw the intelligence from it, which can help you improve the estimating. So you can do that analysis based on your assets or on your project or on your portfolio, so you're very free and flexible in defining yourself how you want to find that intelligence in that. And you can use that again in creating your cost models. So basically making early phase models which can help you identifying costs in a conceptual phase of your project. So one of the ways that we use that intelligence or use that data is to create a breakdown overview. So for instance, per work package, per discipline, or anything else according to one of your structures. So if you have a default standardized CBS cost breakdown structure that you use throughout your projects, and you're able to benchmark your projects throughout your document according to that structure, you're able to compare apples with apples instead of apples with pears, and really draw from that and apply that again. So for instance, the mechanical equipment cost distribution that you see over here, what is the distribution between the different types of equipment items? Same goes for trend analysis, so using regression functions, whether linear or polynomial or anything like that, to determine the relation between the different outcomes of your project. So it could be various units that you're trending towards here. So for instance, we've got later on also an example of the length of the road versus the project costs. So eventually we saw that that's a huge regression, let's say, trend there. So that definitely is something that we can use again in the early phase estimates. So what we see here in the red little red-lined square is the R squared, and that states the usability of the function. So as the closer it is to 1, the higher the regression, or the higher, basically the better the trend, and the more capable you are of using that to do your next analysis. So how can you use that intelligence? So what we have here, for instance, is a distribution chart. So what you see here is the P10, P50, P90 values over a set of projects. So in this case, we're doing that on a metric. So the metric is, in this case, the costs per meter of road length. So if you know that you're starting a new project and you're doing, in this case, it's a maintenance model. If you know that you're doing maintenance on a road that's 2,500 meters long, you'd know that, okay, if I want to take a P50 approach, those are the estimated costs that you may be taking into account per meter. And obviously, yeah, you can use that as well for different probability scores, and that may advise the contingency that you can apply to that. And eventually, this is what we can create from it. So what you see here is a cost model that we created based on some benchmark information. And we can use that, all that information, to create such models. And these models can be then filled in. So you enter simply a number of parameters of the new project that you're developing. And basically, the costs come out, possibly with a further breakdown of the different disciplines, or maybe according to your work breakdown structure. So it gives you already, in an early phase, with a couple of, let's say, basic parameters of your project, some outcomes that you're able to use. Now, how can we use these in the business objectives that we set? Now, what you see here is we've got our operational environment, and obviously you're basically generating a whole lot of information through that, let's say a whole lot of things are going on, activities, and a lot of things are being recorded throughout that project. Now you collect that, that becomes your data, and once you process that, it becomes information. And then you analyze it, and then it becomes intelligence. And when it's intelligence, you can use it and apply it again. So obviously, you can identify what is a specific KPI that was tending towards this successful project or unsuccessful project. And what lessons can we draw from that? So you can tie the KPIs to the metrics in order to make the project measurable and manageable. So for instance, if you know that indeed so your CPI, for instance, is indeed something that you want to focus on, that this is if you know that, for instance, it's a cost-driven project, this should be something that you're managing specifically. But also indeed the number of hours, looking at the productivity. So for asset owners, we would say incorporate performance bonuses for contractors. based on KPIs. And I've heard from some potential clients that I'm working with in Perth that they're already doing this a lot. As well as that, there's quite a number of owner companies that are giving bonuses to contractors to provide them with quantitative information so they can benchmark that themselves and draw lessons from it. And I think that that's very important, because eventually, if we're just managing on a lump sum project without getting the information actually back to the owners, you're never going to draw lessons from it and be more intelligent and more effective in the way you manage your projects. So for the contractors, obviously, yeah, you want to make sure that you bring in your project within budget and be profitable, looking at the bids that you've filled in. So yeah, use that information, use those KPIs to timely take corrective actions and make sure that you are able to steer the project into the right direction. So a couple of conclusions. Metrics and KPIs can be found and used throughout the project lifecycle, from estimating into your project management or cost management, and the benchmarking phase, obviously, where you eventually draw the intelligence from it. They're essential to determine the presumed cost and the performance of your projects. So both in the estimating phase, using that as being factors in an early phase, as well as using those metrics or using those KPIs during the project management. They're of key importance in order to make sound, data-driven business decisions. Obviously, you want to make sure that you make those decisions based on hard facts rather than whatever you have the gut feeling, basically what's happening within your project. And obviously, Cleopatra can help you in setting that up, using the, let's say, data structures in such a way that we can analyze it, consolidate them, and analyze them throughout the project lifecycle. Any questions? Remarks? Nothing? Okay, well then, thank you for listening, and hope it's been worthwhile your time. I've got to stand back at the main hall, so if you're interested in having a further talk, then please do approach me. Thank you.